The presentation that I'm doing today is specifically about how the perception of electronic music during the first half of the century was defined by 19th century romantic mystical ideas. Yeah, a slight disclaimer is that my PhD was based on Germany, so there'll be a bit of a kind of German bias to this, but I'll also bring in bits of Russia in the early 20th century and France in the early 20th century as well. My slightly provocative presentation is going to challenge the description of this conference, which says that modernist thinking is evident in concrete electronic and computer music from their inception. Instead, I'm going to argue, on the contrary, that it was actually not defined by modernist concepts, but by, on the whole, ideas from the 19th century around romanticism, mysticism, and so on. That's not to say that there were no other influences on electronic musical instrument design, but I would argue that the predominant influence was from romanticism. I think, just to keep the presentation short, that I'm making kind of some very broad assumptions about definitions and words here, with some kind of problematic words like irrational, modernism, and so on. Basically, I'm using the concept of modernism as it would have been understood at the time, which is maybe slightly different to kind of previous interpretations. So essentially, again, a very broad definition, but a break in tradition, veneration of newness, the application of technology to a social context, rationality, and rationalization in the sense of Fordism, Taylorism, and so on. So techniques of efficiency, mass production, but also how rationalization was applied sociologically in society itself, into behavior, and so on and so on. And romanticism and irrationality, I guess, and kind of just kind of create a clear division between the two, are ideas that derived from the 19th century that positioned the human within a kind of harmonic, natural environment, and irrational in that it elevated experience beyond cognitive reason or a fact, to put it basically. So I thought I'd start off with a very brief overview of the evolution of electronic music, electronic musical instruments. And essentially, I think it's fair to say that the beginning of electronic musical instrument design started around the last 30 years of the 19th century. There were examples before that in the 18th century, but this particular era was caused by the convergence of a whole number of different technologies. So telephony, telegraphy, wireless, wired networks, batteries, and electrical systems, distribution systems that allowed many of these things to happen. So on the top, you have Elisha Gray's musical telegraph, which basically was an electronically metal times that were excited electromagnetically, and then the pulse was sent over the telegraph network. This is pre-amplifiers and pre-loudspeaker. In the middle at the top is William Duddle's singing arc, which was essentially a keyboard attached to a carbon arc lamp, which generated a direct spark. So varying the voltage on that gave a different pitch. Quite lucky it didn't take off as a consumer instrument, because it probably would have killed people. On the right is Melvin Severy's rather beautiful wiring loom for his choral cello, which was a massive instrument built into wealthy American capitalist oligarchs in their stately homes. And I think there was about 9 of these built, and one of them still exists. And in the middle is a rather obscure example, which was made by a Canadian priest called Georges Desilets, which again is a kind of a spark transmitter. It used a cone-shaped array of spark gaps, which when it rotated, when you pressed the key, it made a gap between that particular tone. So basically they all span at different speeds and different tones. And by creating a spark, it generated a spark gap radio transmitter. Again, quite lethal, but it would be interesting to see how it looked. And on the left is Hip's electric clavier, which used a roll, a punch picker roll to send electrical impulses to activate electromagnetic times. Again, sent over a telegraph network. So again, these are all. I should also point out it's probably the most well-known one, which is Cahill's Telharmonium, which is 1897, so about 1917, which was another massive electronic instrument which covered 3 floors of a large warehouse in New York, based on hundreds of dynamos acting as tone wheels, sent out electronic music over the early telephone network around America to stations or hotels or to private subscribers. And this is a rather fanciful image of how that would have been consumed, if you like, that the music would have been consumed. So there's no loudspeakers, so basically the electrical voltage from a telharmonium would be transmitted through the electric carbon light at the top above the diners. So they would hear the music from the variable pitch from a carbon light. So basically all of these were pretty much kind of one-off experiments. They exploited the kind of new networks that were available at the time through telegraphy and telephony. But I think what is important, as we shall see, is how they were perceived and how that had an effect on the way electronic music evolved in the first half of the 20th century. So all of this changed in the first decade of the 20th century, with the invention of this thing, which is Leader Forest's early version of a triode valve. And this suddenly allowed the development of amplification, the amplification of radio signals, so you can do long distance radio signals without using spark gap transmitters or that kind of thing. Cheap radio receivers, cheap radio transmitters, but also by creating a feedback loop on this thing, you could create a basic sine wave oscillator. And this was basically the foundation of the next generation of electronic musical instruments, which were generally much smaller, much more affordable, mass reproducible. So at the top we have the self-proclaimed father of German electronic music, Jörg Marger, with his Spiritualism, which was these are all monophonic instruments, with his rotating dial, which allowed a continuous glissando pitch from basically below the hearing threshold to above the hearing threshold. And in the model, in the middle, probably the most well-known is Lev Theremin, or Leon Theremin, with his theremin, which used again the same valve, but allowed the variation of voltage and pitch by human body capacitance. So depending on how far you move from it, you can alter the pitch and the volume. On the right is Mr. Friedrich Trautwein with an early version of the Trautonium, which used a sliding string on like a fingerboard to create a variable tone. What was interesting about this one, that it uses format filters to allow, it filtered the pretty basic sine wave output from it, so it could imitate vocal sounds, string sounds, and so on. Bottom left is Maurice Martineau, who's Ernst Martineau, which again is quite a well-known instrument still used in orchestras today. In the middle is the Classe Sonore, which is by a Russian emigre to Paris. And on the right is the Kubler brothers with their programmable electric valve-based organs. So again, it's using technologies from industry, so weaving and so on, to with a paper roll to allow some kind of programmable interface. So I guess what was always interested me with this particular bit of history is that, considering the sudden arrival of all of these instruments, which had microtonal abilities, they have different kind of performative abilities, they could use filters to imitate all sorts of animal sounds, vocal sounds. You could program them to play at superhuman speeds. You could program them to play clusters of notes beyond the amount of human fingers there are. That essentially they were not used by the avant-garde at all in the first 50 years of the 20th century. And not only that, but actually their abilities weren't used. They were mostly used in kind of reproducing already existing forms of music. Now, I'll just play a bit of Charles Vines. This is a piece by Hindemith, Paul Hindemith, who was very involved in the development of the Charltonian. He insisted on this slide mechanism because he was a viola player. He wanted to use it for that sort of music. So he wrote a number of pieces in the 1930s for an exhibition in Berlin, and it sounded something like this. So essentially, he's using the same forms of a string quartet. So you have four. This is a quartet of Charltonians, which was basically replicating the quartet type of music. And he didn't use any of the kind of glissando effects that were strikingly modern at the time, and he didn't use any of the kind of four-month filters to change this radically the sound. I'm going to argue that the reason why this wasn't used is because early electronic musical instruments were viewed in the same way that technologies were viewed in the 19th century. Basically, ideas that formed around electricity and technology were closely linked to mystical ideas of the ether, of spiritualism, and so on. And after the First World War, there was a sudden explosion of the kind of neo-spiritualist ideas like neo-vitalism, biocentrism, Liebens philosophy, Steiner's anthroposophy and theosophy, and so on. And this was a modern interpretation of romantic ideas of the 19th century, which were then applied to technology. And this, I would argue, became the kind of dominant view. So one idea was the idea of the ether, which was a invisible gas or undefined matter that that linked all living things together. Especially in vitalism, this was a kind of medium for transmitting not just sound, but also kind of vitalism between living things. In the middle of, but with the appearance of telegraphy in the 18th century, spawned new ideas about spiritualism and how spirits communicated with the living, and the idea of the spiritual telegraph evolved from telegraphy. So telegraphy appeared before these ideas of spiritualism. So in seances with knocking on tables and so on was derived from the tapping of the telegraph system. So there's a very clear linkage there, and there's many books. This is by Andrew Jackson Davis in 1853, which is a very lengthy book detailing in detail how this system worked and how modern technology could be used to link the dead with the living, which to our ears sounds somewhat ludicrous, but in a way was the best way of making sense with these complex and otherworldly technologies. I mean, Sconce in what was Haunted Media, I think, was saying that talking the dead through raps and knocks, after all, was only slightly more miraculous than talking with the living, yet absent through dots and dashes. Both involve a subject reconstituted through technology as an entity at once interstitial and uncanny. Spiritualism attracted the belief of many converts because it provided, and I think this is the important sentence, a technically plausible system of explanation for these seemingly occult occurrences. So I think it was the best possible explanation for things like radio, like telegraphy, and then things like electronic music. And I think maybe just to reinforce this point is that a lot of audio media was originally designed not for the mass reproduction of music, but for a variety of other ideas. And one of them was Edison's pursuit of recording the dead. So his original design for the gramophone was to somehow capture spirits. And the way he saw it was that when you died, basically your spirit dissolved into some kind of atomic structure and floated through the ether. But this could somehow be captured and embedded into a physical object like a disc or a wax cylinder or some kind of electronic valve. And he came up with the idea of a necrophone. And he was actually in complete, with direct competition with Tesla, who was also trying to achieve a similar sort of necrophone idea. Needless to say, they didn't. And we ended up with a gramophone for reproducing music. So if we move forward a bit into the 20th century with the advent of electronic musical instruments, the stage had already been set to how we interpret technology, whether or not it's telegraphy or radio, and these instruments are very connected through radio. They use radio technology. They were seen in the same frame, they were seen through the same lens, and particularly instruments like this one, which again is Leon Theremin with his theremin. He adopts a very kind of medium-like pose in a seance, and repeatedly you'd see in press reports that he was magically conjuring sound through the ether. And this became a very typical way of looking at these instruments. So these instruments were called ether wave instruments, and the music was ether wave music. The word electronic music didn't come around until the 1950s, really. And this was a point of debate in the 1920s. So in 1930, there was a publication of a book called Kunst und Technik in Berlin, which was a collection of ideas about technology and art. Ernst Morgan, the philosopher, came up with this idea of Maschinenromantik, which was a kind of application of romanticism to modern technology. And he saw it as a dangerous idea because it was about the sublime of new technology, it being in awe of new technology rather than actually understanding it. And he saw that as a dangerous anti-modernist concept. Ernst Morgan, again, his ideas went back to the idea of music of the spheres. So he had his spherophone was essentially a way of reproducing the music of the spheres, so the hidden sound of the planets since the ancient Pythagorean ideas that affect us all. So he was trying to uncover hidden mystical truths through sound. I'm going to speed up a bit because I think we're running out of time. And maybe the most obvious one was Nikolai Obukov's Poissonneau, which is 1920s, 1917, which was a centerpiece for Rosicrucian ritual. There's a bit of video here, which I'm going to play. Invented all sorts of other equipment which also worked beyond the level of the range of human hearing, which he believed had a kind of direct physical effect on the human. But essentially, he saw electronic instruments as a kind of lightning rod conveyor of spiritual inspiration into the performers to be distributed around the audience. And another French, well-known French instrument was the Ernst Morgan. And this is a octet of Ernst Morgan playing at 1937 Paris Expo. And that's Brigitte Martineau, Ernst Morgan's sister. I think an interesting aside here is that, especially in the French tradition, electronic instruments were seen as an instrument for women players. And this is also the same with the theremin. Most of the virtuoso players were all women, and also for the Poissonneau, was only allowed to be played by women. And it was never really explained why that was the point, but why that was the case, but probably to enhance the ritual aspect of it, to put it in a kind of liturgical tradition, but perhaps it's an interesting direction of research. So we've got some sound here, which is André Jolivet. So just to give an idea, and it kind of continues this idea of ritual music and mystical music. So there was a particularly French version which was very involved in, very linked towards kind of Catholicism and a very kind of sentimental approach, which was echoed also in Germany in a similar way. I mean, obviously in Germany they followed a different political path, but they retained a similar evolution of the use of electronic music, i.e. they took romantic ideas and tried to fuse that with technology. So, for instance, Joseph Goebbels came up with an idea that described Nazi music after 1933 as Stellene Romantik, which is steely romanticism. And composers like Werner Egg, Karl Orff to a certain extent, used electronic music in a similar way as we've seen in French music here, which was this kind of ethereal sound to give a piece of music a spiritual, mystical quality. There was no attempt to use the other complex aspects of the instruments to do anything else with it. By the end of the 1940s, it became, I think, after the Second World War, this kind of liturgical, romantic application of electronic musical instruments became increasingly anachronistic after the horrors of war. This kind of melodramatic, romantic idea of technology and music looks very out of place. And an interesting fact that I came across through this research was that Pierre Boulez in the 1930s worked at the Folies Bergère Orchestra playing Ernst Morgan. But by 1940, he became very disaffected with this type of music and kind of publicly declared that it was too sentimental, the vibrato unbearable, and the music written for it was ugly, mosh, which is a good word. And he, as an aside, he said it was brothel music. So he wasn't talking specifically about the Ernst Morgan here, but also about the whole genre of pre-1940s electronic music in France, particularly, but also in Germany. So I think that's a good indication to the kind of the way electronic musical instruments of that era were viewed post-war. So yeah, so my argument is that the predominant factor in the evolution, or the defining factor of the character of electronic musical instruments and electronic music during the early part of the 20th century was through romantic spiritualist ideas. And this continued until, I think there's two factors here. One was the anachronistic and politically tainted ideas of Stalin and Antique and the Nazis. But also, I think there was an increasing process of commodification. So essentially, equipment, electronic equipment, things like radios, like gramophones, electronic instruments, and so on, were demystified. They were actually just the otherworldly became mundane.